Hello and welcome to the McHale Report podcast. My name is John McHale, Group Editorial Director for Military Embedded Systems and host for today's event. Our guest today is an old friend of mine, Ethan Plotkin, CEO of GDCA. Today we discuss all that happens with the military aftermarket world, MOSA, AI, and much more. So Ethan, please provide a brief description of your responsibility within GDCA, your experience in the defense industry, and tell us what GDCA stands for.
Great. Hey, once again, John, thanks for having me on. It's always a pleasure. So GDCA stands for Great Designs Continued Always. We're a legacy equipment manufacturer that manufactures and sustains and repairs obsolete circuit card assemblies. So what makes us a legacy equipment manufacturer is that we only sustain and manufacture old gear. We don't really do new product introduction at all. And what we do is we partner with embedded OEMs. Think Curtiss-Wright, think Amatec, think Motorola, the old Motorola Computing Group, and we'll basically take over their old designs and then continue to sustain them for those customers who really just cannot upgrade now or maybe sometimes ever. So as CEO of GDCA, I consider myself like a chief evangelist for the idea of sustainment. And the idea of sustainment as opposed to last time buy and then a quick or forced obsolescence, forced tech refresh. And a lot of times extending the life of an old design can be a lot more cost effective and lower risk than addressing the need with like a tech refresh. So one novel way of sustainment that we do, we call it a new source of supply, which is basically partnering with that OEM, as I mentioned, to restart the production line for those obsolete CCAs, which, as I mentioned, can be less expensive and less risky. So that's what I do kind of in my day job with GDCA. On my night job, I also work as a member for the National Defense Industry Association for the past several years. And this is basically a trade association based out of Washington, D.C., like so many of the associations. And that is when the government wants to, specifically the DoD, but sometimes Commerce, when they want to talk to industry about policies or resolving issues, they will work with NDIA or AIA and other industry associations to basically tease out and ease areas of friction between the industrial base and government. Final piece around that, obviously for GDCA, we're all about sustainment, right, and helping clients. But for NDIA, the real focus is it's much larger, it's how do we position America in this great power struggle that is really emerging and accelerating in the world today. Specifically, it was China, but obviously there's Russia, North Korea, Iran, and they all have kind of their own designs. So that really is in the area of how can we, number one, have enough manufacturing capacity to be able to have good national defense. So how do we have resilient supply chains so that if there are shocks like obsolescence, for example, how do we overcome those shocks and continue producing parts?
And like you said, you're heavily involved in the defense market. We work with NDIA, and we all know that the defense life cycles don't match commercial technology life cycles. It's not. But yet the military is a consumer of commercial tech, just like the rest of us. So hence the need for aftermarket suppliers like GDCA. When these commercial parts go obsolete, they need to call you guys. But how is that market performing for defense aftermarket stuff? Is it?
Well, I gotta say the defense aftermarket has been strong for many years, and right now it's never been better, but not necessarily for the reasons that folks think. So for sure, defense demand is a factor, right? So, we've been using old systems longer than ever before. Defense budgets are tight. It leaves programs behind. And there's not really enough money for every single program to stay completely current with all of the new technology. And an analogy I use a lot is, people are like, oh, we have an $800 billion defense budget, and that is true. But when you take off 70% of that budget for just operations like fuel and people and the logistics, that leaves what, $2.4 billion, give or take, for the rest of that stuff. And when you look at the sophistication and the number of the defense systems that we have, in the end, it's not so much money as you would think. So that means a lot of that, and then a lot of those foreign conflicts that we're talking about, it means that the gear is being used And then, the government is extending the life of workhorse systems and repairs. Um, but also, supply is the main reason. Supply chain obsolescence is really the main reason why the defense aftermarket is so good, and specifically, so much of stuff in defense systems is commercial, are commercial parts. Indeed, and commercial component life cycles, they're accelerating, right? It's a lot of the same memory that's in phones is also in defense systems. Also, mergers and acquisitions in the commercial space means a lot of the stuff, the gear, it gets cut off a lot earlier or maybe without announcement than it would have in the past, which has a waterfall effect. It affects the board makers, it affects the system makers, and it affects the end users. We call that the waterfall effect. And then finally, now that the new administration is signaling their intent for smaller and more efficient government, I sense cost-effective sustainment solutions will continue to gain traction as an attractive alternative to those traditional solutions I mentioned previously, like obsolescence, forced tech refresh.
Yeah, I've heard it said in the past that, when DoD funding for R&D is high, aftermarket parts demand tends to be lower, but when vice versa, when R&D spending goes down, is that, but what you're saying, that might not necessarily be true going forward because of the
Yeah,
way
I mean,
the cost
I
of the
think there's
sustainment
absolutely,
efforts.
yeah, there's absolutely truth in that statement that you said, right? But I think it's less tied to R&D than other factors. And specifically, I think, back in the old days when defense put in a lot of R&D, this would have been really the main truth, right? But now that the reality is that, I've heard people talk about, hey, look, we spend less amount of R&D as a percentage of our gross domestic product than we ever have before. And, but I look at it a little bit differently. I think with the introduction of commercial off-the-shelf stuff, a lot of that R&D has actually been handled by commercial companies, right? So where the Defense Department would have paid a Lockheed Martin or a Northrop Grumman or a Raytheon to do R&D and develop this thing, and they would have created their own semiconductors and created their own computers, right? And that would have been straight out of the government's pocket. Now, that's actually a percentage of every single commercial company's budget, right? Is manufacturing and engineering and innovation. And so if you look at the collective, I mean, look, a good company is probably spending what, upwards of 5% of their top line on R&D. So you take all these big companies in the hundreds of millions, sometimes in the billions, and you take 5% of that and you put it all together. I think that the R&D spend is quite a bit larger than a lot of people think it is. So indeed, I've heard that 70% or more of parts inside of defense systems are commercial off-the-shelf circuit card assemblies. And that is all stuff that was funded by a company's R&D. And so in the end, I think that whole idea around commercial off the shelf, it really is a double-edged sword. On the plus side, you get a lot faster new product introduction, which is great, and that's what you really want. But on the other side, there are challenges that occur when parts become end of life, and that is indeed where, legacy equipment manufacturers like GDCA really come in to their own and help.
Yeah. So, and that, one of the questions I like to ask aftermarket suppliers is, what's the oldest part or board you got that you're still supplying to the defense market?
Yeah, that's fun. I get that question a lot, because people are like, huh, I mean, you can't do 10 years, can you? And we're like, man, we do 20. And they're like, really, when? Right. And so we do a number that are more than 20 years, but there's one that really comes to mind because it's just still going so strong. And that would be an old Motorola VME design. It was introduced, and that
Amy
VME
is not going
architecture
anywhere.
standard,
It's gonna
man,
be here forever.
it is
Yeah.
solid. It is solid in all its forms. And that design was introduced back in 97. It was discontinued in 2005. So that's an 8-year lifespan, not too shabby. It was transferred to us and resurrected in 2006. And so do the math, that's 19 years after 19 years after it was discontinued, that we continue to do spares and repairs high volume today. And interestingly enough, that is a really good example of a dual use product. It controls a Gatling gun that's ship mounted called the Phalanx, and it's a gun, kind of a defensive last resort. Not too long ago, actually, early in 2024, it defended a ship against one of those Houthi rebel missiles. and it got close
Remember
enough.
that?
It perforated that pretty well. But that same part for many, many years was also used in the Indiana Jones ride at Disneyland. So, and it makes sense, right? It's kind of the same shock vibe, moisture type specs. But that's, I think, a really another good example of how dual use and the government can really benefit from commercial products. And in this case, commercial applications also benefited from, kind of government purpose kind of stuff.
Well, I would say that too. I remember buying a computer with a friend, and I said, "You see all that says Intel inside those processors? They're also inside every radar and
Yes,
system
sir.
electronic warfare. Intel just doesn't like to tell you that." So now we're going to go from old stuff to new stuff, and how the guys who make the old stuff are leveraging the new stuff. Do you follow that? So basically, everybody's talking about AI, AI this, AI that. You got AI to walk down the street, you got AI to walk your dog, but AI is in so many different ways and in so many different definitions. How do you leverage AI in your business? Is it more on the manufacturing side? Where does that come in, or if you're even bothering with it?
Yeah, actually, John, I gotta say that my AI chatbot is actually enabled with voice cloning, is conducting this interview with you today, right
Oh,
now. Um,
wow.
but actually, I wasn't supposed to say that. So, but joking aside,
Is
okay.
this an
So this
obsolete
is
model, or are you gonna
yeah,
buy this
exactly.
line?
Not obsolete yet, John. But no, 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 no. Joking aside, we are starting to implement AI in general business practices right now, much like you would like a talented intern. That's how my team is beginning to use AI. So, uh, starting with like reviewing and editing marketing copy, emails, and even performing first pass research. Obviously, I wouldn't yet trust, and maybe never will, because I'm an old guy, might not ever trust AI to do a finished product. But I think to kind of get you started so that it's easier to review something than to create something with a blank sheet of paper, that's probably the primary first way that we're doing it. And then I think once we kind of get that really and we're doing this right now because it's more of transactional AI, but then we're also implementing enterprise AI right now, which is basically an AI that can look at everything that's inside of your firewall in your enterprise and then help you educate you on that. So it could do things like first pass contract review, like you put all your T's and C's into the AI and then put a new T and C in from a customer and say, hey, what's wrong with this? It'll go ahead and redline it and basically say, hey, we don't typically sign up to that liability clause. We prefer these types of liability
So
clauses.
it's
So
making
it could,
procurement. It's going to make procurement easier.
I think it's so. I think it's
Okay.
so. So, and then, I think in the end, I think my holy grail immediately is kind of business performance reporting. So if you could ask an Oracle, like, hey, do me an analysis of profitability for, this particular product line over the last couple of years, give me the materials breakdown, how has it varied? I think that there's AI's there today. So that's another thing that I'm looking to do with enterprise AI.
Okay. Um, talking about procurement, we also can talk about something else that's trending. I know you were at the conference I was at just last month. It comes up is the DoD's push towards a modular open systems approach, or MOSA, where they want to leverage open architectures in new defense systems and upgrade. How does that impact what you do?
I think that's good stuff. MOSA is interesting for folks who might not be familiar with it. MOSA is a strategy whereby, and it's kind of a government-sponsored, government-led strategy. I think another thing that commercial enterprise will benefit from, and it's whereby engineers design systems to use parts interchangeably, electronics parts interchangeably, and when they're talking about interchangeably, I think they're really talking about mainly physical interchangeability. So, and while I think that will be helpful for upgrading systems, right? Because a connector is a connector and then they'll fit,
Right.
right? A next generation board. I think there'll still be a fair amount of software changes anytime a new part is introduced. And why is that? So most defense systems run on, what folks call RTOS, right? Real-time operating systems, versus Windows, which is not a real-time operating system. And RTOSs are a lot thinner. They do a lot less management of the application than like a Windows, for example. But what does that mean? That means your software application actually has to do a lot of that stuff that Windows would have otherwise done when you're writing in a real-time operating system environment. And so what that really means is that the software, anytime you change the hardware, the software is probably going to need to be cracked open And that really is something that everybody really wants to avoid doing. So I think what it really means in the end is that most is good for hardware interchangeability, but because of that software piece, I think that uh, there's still going to be a need for aftermarket suppliers to extend the life of the hardware in situations where application OEMs and end users don't necessarily want to go through the recertification of cracking open the software to upgrade.
Software is always the most expensive part of any military system, any system design. And also there's the other factor is these guys don't like to change things if it's not fixed. If it's not broken, why am I fixing it? Which is
Yeah.
why VME has lasted so long and will still last long. It was only overtaken by its successor VPX in total orders like a year or two ago.
Oh, wow.
And then 1553 is another one, Mill Standard 1553, the database protocol. I once wrote a headline, Death Taxes in 1553, things you can count on. You probably add VME to that. So,
Yeah.
and I think that's probably a misconception that people might have about aftermarket is mostly going to hurt that business. And what you're saying, it's not. What are some other misconceptions about aftermarket people that you hear, you come across when you talk to customers?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the most common is the notion that aftermarket parts are exclusively created by reverse engineering an OEM's part.
Okay.
And that's not unusual, by the way. That does happen, right? That's the classic clone. But I think most people may not know that OEMs themselves offer the majority of aftermarket support in terms of spares and repairs. Um, However, at some point, the OEM themselves, in this case, we're talking again about the embedded, like the board and system OEMs, they can't really make money on aftermarket because the opportunity cost is just too extreme, right? Think about it. Chevy could sell if they started manufacturing 1956 Corvettes, which is kind of a classic cool Corvette. They could sell a bunch of them, right?
You can probably charge more than they do for the current model.
They could, even if they charged
Yes.
four times the current model, by the way, which is not a cheap model, but it's a supercar. So what do you want,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
They would find a bunch of people willing to buy it. But compared to the amount of money of people who want to buy the new Corvette, it's not gonna move the needle for Chevy. And so I think that's where LEMs like GDCA come in. LEMs team with OEMs to take over responsibility for aftermarket services that fall below their target ROI or otherwise distract from new product introduction. So this means an LEM's parts are authorized by the OEMs themselves, which reduces both cost and risk of aftermarket support. And that's how LEMs service the aftermarket a little bit differently than, for example, brokers who have really good space in the market, and then engineering boutiques who do reverse engineering.
Okay. And I think another common misconception was the one I mentioned earlier, that it's just because, R&D spending or investment in tech is up, it doesn't mean it's bad news for companies like yourselves, because basically
That's
what the
true.
trends you're seeing, right? And
Yeah.
so, and along those lines, because you kind of tied it into maybe the new administration's goals, how that will impact sustainment. But along those lines, one of the things I'm hearing from them, and obviously the whole Doge thing, but speeding up the acquisition process, which is something we cover a lot here. And I'm really curious because people think it's too slow. You talk to anybody in this business, they say it takes forever. That's why you have all these things like other transactional authorities, rapid equipping forces. How do we get around that DoD acquisition process?
Mhm.
But that slow speed, does it help or hurt aftermarket sales? How does that with you guys?
I think that acquisition reform, the concept of it, where OTAs came out and then the five new categories, that's been an ongoing challenge and a topic of conversation for decades. And the aim, of course,
Yes.
being to get suppliers on contract faster, which shortens the time to field new systems, right? All the paperwork and contract work up front. And while long acquisition timelines do create pressure to on programs to extend life cycles longer than they otherwise would, because they're kind of going through the whole award and contracting process, it really is the technical challenge after the award that typically takes most of the time, in my experience. I mean, these are extremely complex and complicated systems that require a lot of people looking after a lot of details. And if you get anything wrong, I mean, it's a needle in a haystack. It's critical missions and can fail, and people will die. So this is why I'm a proponent of the idea of, get ready for it, sustainment reform, right, within the DoD.
Okay.
I was on a panel with
I
a
like
senior.
it.
I love it. I love it. I was on a panel with a senior DLA guy, and he goes, everybody's talking about acquisition reform. Why don't we talk about sustainment reform? And I was like, why indeed? So I'm picking up the
It's like
colors
you're
on
speaking
that.
Ethan's language right now.
Exactly. I'm
Yeah.
like, you had me, Ken. You had me at sustainment reform. So, and that basically is featuring policies and practice that enable defense programs to more quickly evaluate all available options around sustainment, including engaging legacy equipment manufacturers to establish new sources of supply, basically restarting the production line in partnership with OEMs.
And that ties, I think, into most because most of the big mandates with parts of the MOSA mandate is for any tech refreshes to embrace an open architecture. So,
Mhm.
and maybe an open architecture means being open to past standards, right? And being able to, because VPX, VITA standards all play a role in there. So you're going to have to somehow communicate, or the boards will have to work with a VME board in the system or whatever. So I would think it almost goes hand in hand in some respects.
Yeah.
Uh, because it is still a commercial part. You're just keeping it alive in a lot of ways.
Yep.
So it's an open
That's right.
standard. It's a common
That's right.
standard. VME is a common standard.
Look,
So
standards are awesome, and I really the stuff that Vita does and PicMig and all the rest. I mean, this is really quality stuff. It's needed. It's needed. I mean, what would be life like? What would life be like if there was not USB or USB-C? It would be more of a mess.
yes. And so your company that kind of brings things back from the past. So let's look forward. Is there a disruptive technology or innovation that will be a game changer in the aftermarket world? I mean, you're a kind of guy. I've seen your presentations. You can kind of go out there and take that view. So what are you seeing?
Futurism, yeah, yeah. I always try my best, but
Yes, you do.
I don't generally like to look back on my past predictions because I'm not that good. But
We're not
who
going to, we
is?
promise not to come back in 5 years and see if we were
Good,
right.
good, exactly.
But
Well, okay, so I think there's a number of technologies that are going to continue to deliver incremental changes to sustainment, state of the art, like AI to aid in hardware and software development, MOSA on interchangeability. We've talked about that stuff, and I think that will continue to deliver those incremental changes. But I sense the largest disruptive uh, in the industry will be a philosophical change. And I think this would be a big disruption. And that's mainly the idea of commercial product obsolescence is an industry problem that is best handled with an industry solution. Until now, DoD policy has largely been focused on solving obsolescence problems around extending life cycles organically. And for sure, there are a lot of talented engineers and logisticians in the DoD, but they really will never be able to have or match the capacity or scalability of an industrial supply base that is much larger and more sophisticated, precisely because they are constantly innovating with new technologies. I mean, that's their lifeblood in industry is better, faster, more sophisticated. So if folks take one thing away from this podcast, it's that there are LEMs out there like GDCA who specialize in the lowest cost risk path to sustaining old technologies for as long as they're needed.
doesn't that philosophical paradigm shift, doesn't it also go along with sustainment reform, which you just talked about?
It does.
I think that kind of blends with that. I mean, that's what, especially within defense circles, if there's another, how do you, I think reform is needed there because, as you said, if you can be smart about how you're doing your sustainment, maybe leveraging the old technology, working with you or working with, the folks like Lansdale and Rochester on the component level is the way to go, as opposed to just tossing the whole system and starting over.
I couldn't agree more.
Ethan, it's always good talking to you. Thank you so much for speaking today. I always learn a lot, and I hope our audience did too. And I want to thank all of you for listening today. And I will see you on future McHale Report podcast. Thanks. Have a great day.
Thank you, John.